Hey heroes, and welcome to another aquatic episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelade. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Previously on the channel, we've talked about the origins of the undersea kingdom of Atlantis and the blue-skinned water-breathing race that inhabited it. But before we delve into this week's topic, I want to begin with a clarification about the origins of the undersea Atlantean people. As discussed numerous times on the channel before, Atlantis was originally an island continent in the Atlantic Ocean, but sank to the bottom of the sea amidst the global upheaval of the Great Cataclysm, circa 18,000 BCE. And in the wake of this, a small fraction of the continent's human inhabitants survived by adapting to life underwater. Now, in the generations that followed, many undersea Atlanteans believed that it was the ocean god Neptune who endowed the survivors of old Atlantis with the ability to survive underwater. And in recent years, this theory has basically been confirmed by Neptune himself. Additionally, it's also been revealed that Neptune was apparently responsible for sinking Atlantis to the bottom of the sea, which does make a certain amount of sense. Obviously, he wasn't responsible for the entirety of the Great Cataclysm, which was caused by multiple factors, the most notable of which being the celestial attack on the Deviant Empire, but it makes sense that Neptune would use the ensuing flood as an opportunity to sink the Atlantean continent and create more followers for himself. Now, I will also note that some sources have suggested that the water-breathing Atlanteans were actually extraterrestrial in origin, having migrated from the water world Vodani. The truth, however, appears to be twofold, in that humans who were transformed into water breathers by Neptune encountered and intermingled with the Vodani, and their descendants ultimately became the Atlantean people we know today, Homo mermanus. Of course, there were also examples of groups of Homo mermani breaking away from Atlantean culture and establishing other tribes like the barbaric Skarka and the Set-worshipping Lemurians. But with all that out of the way, we'll really begin this week's story by discussing some notable events in Atlantean history. First, we look back many centuries to the reign of King Thalo, when an Atlantean scientist named Chiral developed a method of growing entire creatures from a sample of genetic material. Using this technique, the Atlanteans attempted to breed a race of clones to serve them, but these clones soon began to outnumber the naturally born Atlanteans, which put a tremendous burden on the environment. Eventually, the clones began to demand equal rights and, rallied by one known as Delta 9, threatened to instigate a violent uprising. Unfortunately, the Atlantean king Thalo saw only one solution to this problem and ordered that every clone be executed in a bloody campaign that became known as the Night of the Long Spears. In the wake of that debacle, cloning technology was banned in Atlantis, and its use became a crime punishable by death. Next, another event that happened some centuries ago was when the Atlantean Council of Elders uncovered lost data on the relationship between humans and Atlanteans. Interested in the mutagenic possibilities of reuniting these genetic lines, the Elders established a eugenics program to study the potential effects of hybridization. However, this remained mostly conjecture for centuries. Next, in the mid-1800s, during the reign of King Imanu, there was an incident in which Skarka barbarians attacked and drove the Atlanteans out of their ancestral home. Imanu was killed in the conflict, and his son Thakor ascended to the throne, leading his people southward to the Antarctic, where they built a new Atlantis, sometimes called the City of Thakor, to serve as their new capital. Finally, in 1920, we have the birth of Namor the Submariner, the mutant son of the Atlantean Princess Fen, Thakor's daughter, and the human sea captain Leonard Mackenzie. While Namor's skin tone was similar to that of his father, he also possessed distinctly Atlantean traits like his pointed ears, and his hybrid nature endowed him with great potential. As he grew up, it became clear that he was far stronger than the average Atlantean and could survive both in the water and on land. However, it was eventually discovered that spending too much time in one environment without exposure to the other would result in an oxygen imbalance that caused emotional instability and violent mood swings. Additionally, Namor was not just an Atlantean-human hybrid, but a mutant as well, and during his adolescence he sprouted wing-like fins on each of his ankles that allowed him to fly. Of course, this successful hybridization was noticed by an Atlantean scientist named Tulem, who was part of the Elders' eugenics program, and by some accounts may have already been aware of Princess Finn's potential to produce hybrid offspring prior to Namor's birth. At some point in the early 20th century, the exact timeline is unclear, Tulem and his peers captured a number of surface dwellers to use in hybridization experiments, and while these attempts failed to yield results, the scientists did learn what genes to look for in future pairings. And so after finding an Atlantean male who seemed to be a good candidate, they conspired to have him adopted into the royal family, and after he came of age, manipulated him into conceiving a child with an Icelandic human woman that they'd selected as a viable mate. This resulted in the birth of a girl named Aquaria Nautica Neptunia. However, this attempted hybridization also appeared to be a failure, as she was born a normal, blue-skinned Atlantean. Her mother was sent back to the surface world and is presumed to have died sometime thereafter, and her father was forbidden from revealing Aquaria's human heritage. Despite this, her father gave her the nickname Namora, in reference to her cousin Namor. Now, I do want to note that the initial story involving Tulem and the Council of Elders hybridization experiments does raise questions about the overall timeline of events. The initial telling of the story implies that these experiments occurred after Namor's power became evident, but other sources state that Namora was born circa 1921, making her only about a year younger than Namor. Now, personally, I think the best way to reconcile all of this is to just assume that the experiments actually happened years earlier than initially implied, leading the Council of Elders to adopt Namora's father into the royal family when he was still young, and that they resumed their attempts at hybridization shortly after Namor's birth proved it was possible, orchestrating Namora's conception within the next few months. Whatever the case, for the next part of our story, we're going to shift gears slightly and turn our attention towards another Atlantean scientist, a geneticist named Vera. Presumably a colleague of Tulem, Vera was honored and respected among his people, but in 1928 his scientific curiosity led him to recreate illegal cloning technology. By Atlantean law, he could have been put to death, but due to his status, the Atlantean Emperor Thakor decided to show mercy, instead banishing Vera from the kingdom. Several years after that, in the mid-1930s, Namora and her father moved to Antarctic Atlantis, where the tomboyish teenager first met and befriended her cousins Namor and Bera. However, she and her father eventually moved again, relocating to a northern Atlantean colony. Then, in 1939, Namor made his first foray to the surface world when he traveled to New York City. Initially intending to strike against mankind, he ended up befriending an American policewoman named Betty Dean. When Namor clashed with the original Human Torch, Jim Hammond, it was Betty Dean who negotiated a truce between them. In part because of her friendship and the budding romance between them, Namor ultimately wound up fighting alongside the Allies during the Second World War. But for more details on the reasons behind this, you can refer to my original Namor video. Namora was largely uninvolved in this conflict and Namor's other surface activities, but then in 1946, her skin shifted from Atlantean blue to her mother's more Caucasian tone. At the same time, her hybrid strength manifested, and she developed similar abilities to those of her cousin. After that, her father finally revealed to her that her mother was human, and the two returned to Antarctic Atlantis once again. Then, in early 1947, there was an incident in which Atlantis was attacked by a group of human criminals who sought to plunder it for treasures. Led by a man known as Stoop Richards, these invaders killed several Atlanteans in their attack, including Namora's father. Seeking vengeance, Namora joined forces with her cousin Namor, and together the two tracked down and defeated Richards and his gang. Curious about humanity, Namora decided to stay on the surface for a time and moved in with Namor's ally, Betty Dean. During this time, Namora became close friends with Betty while continuing to fight crime alongside Namor. In 1949, the two Atlantean heroes returned home to the sea, but they had further surface adventures in the 1950s and continued their friendship with Betty Dean, surprising her with a genuine pearl necklace for her birthday in 1954. Now, I will note that in the midst of all this, romantic feelings did indeed develop between Namor and Betty, but his station prevented him from ever acting on them, and the two eventually parted ways again. Speaking of romance, in 1955, Namora married an Atlantean man named Talon. However, their relationship became strained when she proved unable to bear his children due to her hybrid nature. Then, in 1957, Namora had a chance encounter with the banished Atlantean scientist Vera. She explained her situation and her desire to be a mother, and Vera examined her hybrid physiology. Now, as a peculiar continuity note, during this examination, Vera remarked that, unlike her cousin, Namora's ankle fins were undeveloped, existing only as tiny buds beneath the surface of her skin. Now, this is something that's actually weirdly inconsistent throughout her early appearances. She did seem to have these wing-like fins in her debut story, and they could easily be seen on the covers of her 1948 solo series. However, the interior artwork in Golden Age and Atlas-era stories often neglected to include them. Furthermore, stories that were contemporaneous with the one that introduced Vera often depicted Namora as wearing boots that covered where her ankle wings would have been. In any event, modern character designs all feature her with the ankle fins, both in flashbacks and in subsequent appearances. To my knowledge, this has never been officially rectified, but if I were to posit an explanation, I would theorize that her ankle fins were originally underdeveloped compared to her cousins, maybe even retracting at some point, but emerged more fully after Vera's examination, perhaps even as an indirect result of his genetic testing. Anyway, getting back to the story at hand, the more important thing is that Namora convinced Vera to use his cloning technology to give her a daughter. To accomplish this, he used her genetic materials to create an embryo, but manipulated the clone's DNA so that it would not be an exact copy, and so that her mutant gene would be active from birth. Upon doing so, however, Vera noticed that the clone's genetic makeup was unstable, leaving a possibility for further mutation. Now, remember how we mentioned earlier that Namor sometimes suffered from emotional instability due to an oversaturation of oxygen in his blood supply? Well, in the case of Namora's clone, it was possible that such a thing would also result in radical physical changes. In an attempt to counteract this, Vera secretly spliced in DNA that he'd harvested from the corpses of Atlantean warriors. With the modified clone then implanted in her womb, Namora carried her child to term like a typical pregnancy, and in 1958 she gave birth to her daughter, Namorita Neptunia, or Nita for short. Of course, she kept the true nature of her daughter's conception a secret to most, confiding only in her cousin Namor. Now, despite being a mother, Namora still had occasional adventures, like when she joined forces with a group of monster hunters on the surface. Meanwhile, the Submariner got into a conflict with a telepath named Paul Destine, or Destiny, that left Namor amnesiac, and he wound up wandering the streets of New York as a vagrant with nobody aware of where he had gone. Destiny also launched an attack on the Atlantean capital that ended with the apparent deaths of Emperor Thakor and Princess Fen. As a result, Namora's cousin Bera took to the throne, and with Antarctic Atlantis in ruins, he led his people back to their ancestral home in the Atlantic. Namora, meanwhile, began searching for the missing Namor, but to no avail. During this time, she was approached by FBI agent Jimmy Woo, who attempted to recruit her onto his team of G-Men. Namora declined his offer, but did lead him to a sunken automaton known as M11, the human robot, which she'd found during her travels. She subsequently spent time with the renowned big game hunter Sergei Kravinoff in what seemed to be a romantic entanglement despite her marriage, and in 1959 the two were recruited onto a team of Avengers assembled by Nick Fury to hunt down escaped Nazi war criminals. She eventually retired from surface adventures, and in 1961 she accepted that her cousin was gone and moved with her husband and daughter to the Atlantean colony Maritanus. Not long afterward, however, that settlement was destroyed by atomic testing on the surface, and Namora's husband Talon was killed. Surviving the devastation, Namora and Namorita relocated once again, moving to the undersea kingdom of Lemuria in the Pacific. That city was populated by a subspecies of Homo mermanus that had separated from the Atlanteans, and due to their worship of the elder god Set, typically possessed scaly, serpent-like skin. Notable among the Lemurians was the high priestess Lyra, who, like Namor and Namora, was a mutant hybrid. Lyra's father was a Lemurian named Lyron, and her mother was a human named Rhonda Morris. There's a lot to that story, so perhaps we'll talk more about Lyra another day, but for now the important thing is that she and Namora eventually became fierce rivals. You see, several years after moving to Lemuria, Namora became attracted to the Lemurian prince Mero, much to the dismay of Lyra, who sought to marry into the royal family. Young Namorita watched in embarrassment as the two women regularly clashed, but then one day Lyra settled their dispute by poisoning Namora with a drug that seemingly killed her, but actually put her into a death-like state of suspended animation. After that, Lyra was wed to Prince Mero. Namorita, of course, suspected that Lyra had killed her mother, but was unable to say anything, especially after Mero was also poisoned and Lyra took his place as Emperor Naga's heir. Meanwhile, on the surface, in the years after Namor's disappearance, Betty Dean married a man named Blake Prentice, taking his last name, but Blake eventually passed away, leaving Betty a widow. Then, some indeterminate amount of time later, the Marvel Age of Heroes dawned with the public debut of the Fantastic Four. Shortly afterwards, the missing Submariner was found by the modern-day Human Torch Johnny Storm, who helped jumpstart the recovery of his memories. While he initially clashed with the Fantastic Four, Namor eventually found his people and was hailed as their rightful king, much to Bera's dismay. There was also an incident in which Namor clashed with the corrupt Lemurian Emperor Naga, but in the end Naga was struck down by a noble Lemurian warrior named Carthon. The people of Lemuria then chose Carthon to lead them, and he forged an allyship with the Submariner. Sometime after that, however, Lyra overthrew and imprisoned Carthon, claiming the title of Empress. Meanwhile, Bera schemed to reclaim the throne of Atlantis from Namor, but ultimately failed and was banished for his efforts. After that, Bera fled to Lemuria, where he forged an alliance with Empress Lyra. While conspiring against the Submariner, Lyra and Bera made their way to the ruins of Antarctic Atlantis, taking Namorita with them, as well as Namora's body. When Lyra left to battle Namor herself, however, she was defeated and Carthon was restored to the throne of Lemuria. Secretly operating out of Antarctic Atlantis, Lyra and Bera embarked on several more failed schemes, but Things started coming to a head when Bira made a deal with an alien race called the Badoon. In short, the Badoon wanted access to a reservoir of radioactive oil that was near Antarctic Atlantis, and joined forces with Bira to get it. Bira, meanwhile, used the oil and possibly Badoon technology to create and nurture a caste of mutant crabs to serve his purposes. He and Lyra then planned to use Namorita to lure Namor into a trap and threatened to desecrate her mother's corpse if she didn't comply. Nita went out in search of her cousin, but the journey proved more exhausting than she anticipated, and ironically it was Namor who found her sleeping in the water. Thinking she was a drowning human due to her skin tone, Namor brought her to the surface and attempted to resuscitate her, but Namorita awakened and struck him with a surprising amount of force. Thinking he was simply a middle-aged pervert, Namorita fled back into the water, and a curious Namor followed. Bear in mind that Nita didn't recognize Namor because she was a newborn when he disappeared in the 50s, and she had never actually met him since then. In any event, she unknowingly completed her mission as Namor followed her back to the Antarctic, where he was seized by one of Bira's mutant crabs. He then encountered what appeared to be a giant talking crab calling itself Salamar the Sustainer. However, this was actually a robot that was built and controlled by Bira, who hoped to trick Namor into helping rebuild the Antarctic Atlantis. As part of this convoluted scheme, he attempted to keep Namor off balance by showing him the entombed body of his cousin Namora, which is actually how Namor first learned of her fate. However, Namor soon saw through Salamar's mechanical facade and discovered that Bira was the one controlling it. With his ruse exposed, Bira then tried to force Namor's cooperation by holding Namorita hostage, revealing to him that she was Namora's daughter. However, Nita broke free and helped Namor battle both Bira and Lyra once again. During this conflict, however, Bira was betrayed by the Badoon, who launched an attack on all parties involved in the hopes of seizing the radioactive oil for themselves. The scene erupted into chaos as Bira's mutant crabs started slaughtering the alien invaders, but in the end Namor put a stop to the whole conflict by using explosives to destroy the radioactive oil and collapse the cavern that contained it, burying the crabs and remaining Badoon soldiers in the process. Lyra was also caught in the cave-in and seemingly crushed, but she survived and eventually resurfaced. Of course, with the oil gone, the leader of the Badoon, Brother Royal, departed to plan other conquests. In the wake of that conflict, the coffin containing Namora's preserved body remained in the Antarctic cave where it was left. At some point, however, this sealed coffin was outfitted with a holographic illusion that made it seem as if it had been broken open, and that Namora's corpse had decayed in the water. Furthermore, the body was left guarded by surviving mutant crabs, who were programmed to attack if the illusion was ever dropped. While I don't believe that this has ever been confirmed, it seems most likely that Lyra was responsible for this, presumably having previously set this up with Bira's help. I would personally theorize that Lyra suspected that Namora wasn't fully dead, but didn't want to risk awakening her by trying again to kill her, and instead left a trap for anyone that might come looking for her. In any event, getting back to the story at hand, Namor nearly executed Bira for his scheming, but Nita, not wanting to lose any more family members, convinced her cousin to let him go free. Despite their familial connection, Namorita developed something of an innocent crush on Namor, but this was short-lived and more indicative of her growing interest in men in general than any real romantic feelings towards her cousin. Also, let's remember that Nita's grandfather was adopted into the royal family, and so she wasn't actually related to Namor by blood. It's also worth noting that while Namorita's actual age is of course something that's been complicated by the sliding time scale, at this point in time she still appeared to be physically and mentally adolescent, the equivalent of a human teenager. As such, Namor was unwilling to involve her in his adventures and didn't much care for the idea of being her guardian. Instead, he entrusted her to the care of his and Namora's trusted friend, Betty Dean Prentice. Once again, it's perhaps best not to think too hard about the implications of the sliding timescale and just assume that Betty aged very gracefully. In any event, keeping a superhuman teenager out of trouble proved to be a tall order for the retired policewoman. But despite all this and the challenges that came with adjusting to life on land, Namorita proved to be a quick learner, and under Betty's tutelage she was able to quickly earn her high school diploma. Finding the political climate of the surface world jarring due to her sheltered upbringing in Lemuria, Nita became an outspoken political activist and participated in anti-war demonstrations. Of course, Betty didn't always agree with the way Namorita went about things, but nonetheless became something of a surrogate mother for her. Later, during Nita's semester break, Betty decided to take her on a Florida vacation as a reward for her excellent grades. During the flight, however, their plane was attacked and its passengers were taken captive by a supervillain known as Dr. Hydro. Now, regular viewers of the channel may recall that in previous videos we've sometimes mentioned a rogue inhuman named Fader, who, along with his son Maelstrom, sometimes aided human scientists with questionable morals. Well, Dr. Hydro is apparently yet another example of this, as he was originally a scientist named Herman Frayne, until Fader provided him with a chemical compound that allowed him to transform himself and others into humanoid amphibians known as Hydro-Men. Naturally, this compound was originally derived from the mutagenic Terrigen mist typically used by the Inhumans. A student of ecology, Dr. Hydro became convinced that the only path for humanity's survival was to build a new society under the sea. To this end, he transformed many of his captives into Hydro-Men, including Betty Dean Prentice. Of course, due to her already amphibious physiology, Namorita was unaffected, and she ultimately escaped and joined forces with Namor to battle Dr. Hydro's forces after they invaded Atlantis. In the end, Hydro was defeated, and Namor allowed Betty and the other transformed victims to stay in Atlantis, while Namorita advocated for their assimilation into Atlantean society. Nita also continued her schooling, attending college on Long Island, where she roomed with a fellow student named Annie Christopher. Around this time, she encountered an alien known as Wonder, and saved him from drowning. She figured out that despite appearing to be an adult physically, Wonder was still a child mentally, and with permission from Ben Grimm, who had been watching over Wonder, decided to take him in and to become his protector. As a result, Namorita became part of the Fantastic Four's social circle and attended their Christmas party later that year. Meanwhile, there was an incident in which Namor was captured by several of his enemies, notably a man named Dr. Lemuel Dorcas. This situation caught the attention of Dr. Doom, who had allied with Namor on occasion, and after deciding to investigate further, Doom was spotted by Betty Dean Prentice. While Prentice and Doom were an unlikely pairing, each was aware of who the other was through reputation. Naturally, Betty was initially dubious of Doom and ended up joining him in tracking down Namor. In the ensuing conflict, when Dr. Dorcas attempted to execute the captive Namor, Betty Dean Prentice leapt in front of the shot, sacrificing her own life to save her old friend. Of course, an enraged Namor then broke free and defeated his foes alongside Dr. Doom. In the wake of that conflict, both Namor and Nita mourned Betty's death, and Nita decided to adopt her surname to honor her, legally becoming Namorita Prentice in surface society. Over the following months, she continued attending college, looking after Wonder, and had occasional adventures, like when she clashed with the villainous Tiger Shark and was rescued by Carol Danvers, known at the time as Ms. Marvel. Eventually, however, she was convinced to turn custody of Wonder over to S.H.I.E.L.D. After exposure to a cosmic cube allowed him to quickly gain an adult-level intellect, Wonder became known as the Aquarian, and started a peaceful movement called the Water Children. While Namorita was briefly involved in this group, she slowly grew disillusioned with the surface world, sometimes clashing with human criminals. After a long period away from home, she returned to Atlantis for a vacation, but once there she realized that societal problems like poverty and inequality weren't exclusive to the human world, and that such issues existed among her people as well. This inspired her to continue her environmental and political activism both on the surface and under the sea, while attending Empire State University in New York. Sometime later, she participated in a field trip in which she and other ESU students visited a soil decontamination operation being carried out by a superhuman-oriented research firm called Gene Tech. However, the experimental technology that Gene Tech employed inadvertently resurrected the hostile alien earthbender and former Herald of Galactus, Terrax the Tamer. Naturally, Namorita was the first on the scene to oppose the rampaging extraterrestrial, but this situation also caught the attention of the vigilante Night Thrasher, who had been gathering allies to form his own superhero team. Night Thrasher, Nova, Firestar, and Justice, known at the time as Marvel Boy, all came to Namorita's aid, as did another hero who saw the fight on the news, Speedball the Masked Marvel. In the end, the assembled heroes defeated Terrax, and Night Thrasher convinced them that they should stay together, and thus Namorita became a founding member of the New Warriors. And so if you guys want to know what happens next, well, you'll just have to load up the Marvel Unlimited app and start reading the New Warriors series from the 1990s. And while you're there, if you want to know what happened to Namora, and if she ever returned, well, the answer to that question is yes, but if you want all the details, you can check out the Agents of Atlas series from 2006. In the meantime, that's all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!